This is coming to you from the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, where we have the opportunity to interview David L. Bernstein, author of the important book, Woke Antisemitism. So David, why this book and why now?
So I have spent my career working in the Jewish community, in the Jewish advocacy world, really making the case for the Jewish people, fighting anti-Semitism. And I became growingly concerned that anti-Semitism was not just a right-wing phenomenon, and it was not just pure anti-Zionism. It was growing amid an ideological shift in American society, and I was seeing the same ideological shift in other English-speaking countries like Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia. And I became concerned that this ideology, which divides the world simplistically into oppressors and oppressed, was viewing Jews as the oppressor and was viewing Israel as the oppressor. And amid that ideological trend, we were seeing a growth of anti-Semitism on the left, and we were seeing growing anti-Zionism as well. So that's why I wrote this. I thought it was very important that the Jewish community be able to connect the dots between this ideology, whatever we want to call it, wokeism, critical social justice, that they were able to connect the dots between that ideology and the growth in anti-Semitism. Because if you don't identify what's causing it, what's fueling it, then you really are not able to fight it effectively.
So that we understand exactly what you're talking about here, can you give us some examples of the ways in which Jewish people are feeling pressure from progressive ideology?
Sure. So you're seeing this in several ways. It's not only at the university campus, it's now sort of escaped the university, if you will, and entered the bloodstream of the society at large. In Stanford University a couple years ago, at a psychiatric clinic, a Jewish psychiatrist and a Jewish social worker asked that they not be placed in a quote-unquote white affinity group. There are very often in the diversity spaces now, they're dividing people up into safe places. So if you're black, you go into a black affinity group. If you're Asian, you go into an Asian affinity group. And if you're white, you go into a white affinity group. They didn't want to be part of the white affinity group. They wanted to be in a Jewish affinity group, but they were not granted permission because they were told by the ideologues who are part of this diversity, equity, and inclusion training that they had to slot themselves into the white category. That's how this ideology operates. When that's in that same context, when there was a town hall meeting that was Zoom bombed, with swastikas and the N-word and other epithets, the DEI people, the diversity, equity, inclusion trainers, refused to talk about the anti-Semitism that came along with the swastikas and only wanted to talk about the racism. That's the kind of thing we're seeing over and over again. Anti-Semitism is being downgraded. It's being treated as a kind of a whine rather than a legitimate form of bigotry that's making people vulnerable. So this is happening over and over again. It's conditioning to society to think in a binary, and that binary is not favorable to Jews.
How is it that the Jewish people ended up in the white oppressor class?
Well, from the standpoint of the people who have sort of fashioned this new ideology, Jews are white, they look white, they become white, they're white passing, they're white adjacent, they're white complicit. They don't understand the nature of anti-Semitism. They don't understand it's different than other forms of bigotry. They're certainly not deeply connected to what happened at the Holocaust. So they look at Jews, they see a community that on average is successful. Not all Jews, of course, are thriving, but many are. And they say, because you're thriving, by definition, and this is important, by definition, it means that you're complicit in the white supremacy that's holding others down. That's the problem, and that's why Jews have not been able to sort of gain any traction, and some have tried, as a progressive certified minority group within this ideology.
And so is it Jewish particularity that is especially an affront to progressive values, and if so, why?
I don't know that it's particularity as so much as the kind of particularity it is. It's a particularity that at the same time has managed to succeed in society. According to this ideology, if you are different than the dominant class, then you should fail, that the dominant class should be holding you down. So the Jewish success story in America, as is the Asian success story in America, shows that the ideology is false in a way. It disproves the ideology, because you shouldn't be able to succeed if you're a group that's experienced discrimination. So it's the kind of particularity. If Jews were a community that by and large were failing and they could blame white supremacy on it, then Jews would probably have a lot more gravitas within this ideological movement.
Okay. So what do you see as ultimately the roots that have brought us to this point in history?
Yeah, well, beginning in the late 1960s, and this ideology started to take place in academia. It started to gain a foothold in academia, and it was really what you might call a neo-Marxist ideology. It replaced the idea of class with race and ethnicity. And the ideologues who were behind this in the late 1960s spoke of the long march through institutions, that they were going to start in academia and slowly but surely gain ground and enter the K through 12 education system, which is, the grammar school education system, which they've successfully done just in the last several years. It's not exactly the same people, but it's the same ideological trend. They were going to be able to take what began in the academy and bring it to the larger society. They've been highly successful in doing it. It's actually quite impressive if you think about it, how much progress they've made in the last 50 years. And so now we're dealing with something that I think a lot of people had hoped would just remain sort of a sideshow in the academy and never enter the society, but it has. And so that's why we're dealing with it now. I think after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer, that became a real cultural moment in American society. And you had all the Black Lives Matter protests, and that really breathed life into an ideology that sought to explain all disparity, all problems in the world. Rather than looking at that and saying we have a problem to fix, it actually tried to install some new software into society, and right now that's what we're pushing back against, this new software.
I see that your book has been well received, but tell me about some of the pushback you've had.
Well, as you can imagine, when you write about such sensitive topics like quote-unquote woke anti-Semitism, there are going to be people who don't want to identify the ideological underpinnings of the left. Even people within the mainstream Jewish community who are trying desperately to remain in the good graces of progressive activists and ideologues, who are trying to prevent any kind of discussion, which could be acrimonious in some places, in their own Jewish communities. So what they do is they claim that I'm fueling acrimony in the community, that this is not the right way to talk about these issues, and they gatekeep me from being able to bring the book to their communities and so forth. That's starting to change, by the way, very rapidly. I mean, the floodgates have opened, but there are still many Jewish communities, including many important Jewish communities, where it would be very hard for me to speak at, because key professionals in that community, and maybe volunteers in some cases as well, desperately want this conversation not to happen.
Tell me about the place of Zionism and the antagonism there seems to be within the progressive left, and why that exists.
It's important to understand that woke ideology, as I'll call it here, is a close cousin to post-colonial ideology, which held that rich countries of the world are holding down poor countries in the world, the former colonized countries of the world, which explains why they're not doing well. So in that framework, Israel and Zionism were always viewed, unfortunately, as a colonialist force. And now you're taking that same template and you're bringing it into the domestic scene in America and other countries, Canada and the other Western countries, and you're dividing people neatly between the oppressed and the oppressors. Where do you think Israel and Zionism are going to fit into this worldview? They're going to be viewed as the oppressor class. Zionism is going to be viewed as a colonial movement, because many of the radical left-wing groups, including radical Palestinian groups, are able to position themselves as the oppressed and the brown, and the Jews or the Israelis as the white. Of course, obviously, Israel is a ethnically diverse country. Anybody who's ever been there is struck by the ethnic diversity as soon as they, walk out of Ben Gurion Airport, or even while they're in Ben Gurion Airport. And it's obviously a false binary, but that's the one that they've been successfully able to inculcate into the body politic.
Well, thank you, David. Your book is an important contribution, and we wish you very well. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate that very much. Thanks so much.